Hey friends, welcome to session 5. So glad that you're back, and I'm here with my friend Justin. I'll let him introduce himself here in just a second, but you've got two bearded men taking you through session 5 as we talk about your home and identifying a child. And so, Justin, would you kind of introduce your family and how y'all got into this?
Hey, this is my family. My wife's name is Meredith, and my two kids are Zoe and Baker. And then baby Jay is down there. He is in the foster care system with us, and he's with us right now. He's been with us for about 5 months, his entire life. And Zoe is about to turn 4. Baker is turning 2 soon. And our family is grown entirely through adoption, both Zoe and Baker, domestic infant adoptions, and also through foster care with baby Jay. And another thing you'll notice, baby Jay is wearing the Thug Life glasses. And so since he is in the foster care system, we kind of honor confidentiality, and kind of covering up faces and not using full names is one way we can just protect his identity and while he's in that system. So the attachments in the workbook is this week is the Hague countries. You'll remember that was talked about last time in session 4. And so the Hague countries are just a group of countries that have come together to agree on some standards and processes that they're going to put around adoptions. And so it can be more bureaucracy, but it also means just more protection and more security safeguards against some poor practices that are able to happen in adoption without those standards. So this week, our fact or myth is neglectful and abusive parents don't love their kids. And that is absolutely a myth. So parents, there's no parent that just wakes up in the morning and says, hey, I want to abuse my kids today. And so no parent has that in their heart or really desires to do that. Oftentimes that is maybe the way they were grown up, the way they were raised, and so it's all they know, or there's a lot of hurts in their life that they just haven't been equipped to deal with well, and bad situations create bad results sometimes. And so no parent desires to treat their kids that way. They love their kids and would desire to make good choices and kind choices for their kids.
Yeah, the thing I would just add to that is oftentimes a bio parent has been raised in sort of that generational cycle of addiction or poverty, and this is what they know. And so, domestic violence is common, drug abuse is common, exposure to pornography and sex outside of marriage are all common things that they likely were raised with. And yet we come from obviously a biblical culture where our biblical worldview informs everything that we do. And so it can be hard to try and line those things up and go, oh yeah, these people love their kids when love looks like neglect and abuse. Or those types of things are common in their family's home. And yet we know that kids have a loyalty to their biological families. Oftentimes they're looking at mom and dad and just going, look, this is all I know. So of course I love them. Of course that's what I'm used to. And so don't find yourself undermining that loyalty, but remind yourself that there's some brokenness going on, often generational brokenness in that family, and you get to step in and both help redirect some expectations for that child and their parents.
Great. And this week we're talking about your home, not just your physical home, but also the people and everything in and around your home. And so we're going to be talking a lot about licensing your home. And so licensing takes on a lot of forms, a lot of documentation. There's going to be a lot of training necessary for you, the adults, and people in your home. So we're going to talk about home studies because that's going to be something that's required no matter what track you go down for foster care or adoption, domestic infant adoption, anything like that. It's going to require some sort of a home study. And so each one of them is very similar, but they all have very unique differences that also set them apart from one another. But you'll definitely see some similarities throughout. And just as a note, the licensing process can take up to 6 months. And so while every process is different, I would anticipate it taking around 6 months for whatever you're going with. The foster care side of things does take around 35 or more hours of training that are often either online or in-person trainings that you have to go to. And there are lots of forms for no matter which path you go down. And so we like to say that there's a form for everything. Anything that happens, there's going to be a form for that. And so just get used to filling out some of that paperwork and get organized and up front and ready. Now, the home study is something that I know a lot of people have probably heard about. And it often has kind of a scary connotation around there. But what a home study actually is, it is a written report by a caseworker that documents your family and just gives an accurate account of you and your home and your family for placing agencies to evaluate. And so there's lots of other documents that are attached with it, but overall it's just an evaluation of your home and your family. So something that's really important to remember when your case studies are coming to do your home study it's good to remember they are on your team. No caseworker's going to show up looking and itching to fail somebody from a home study. They want you to pass, and they want to help you. And so they're not going to come in and white glove your home or anything. So just remember they're on your team, and they want to help, and they just want to get to know you. And so it's just supposed to be, like I said, an accurate report to those placing officials. There'll be interviews. They'll interview every person that lives in your home, whether they are a grandma or mom living with you that's 70 years old, or a child that is 2 years old. They'll want to see that child just play by themselves because they just want to see how they're interacting. And so those will be as family and and alone individually. So those home studies do cost extra. For foster care, they tend to be free. And then for domestic or international adoption, they can range. The high end usually is around $35,000 or $3,000. And the most important thing when you get nervous about home study or anything, just remember God is sovereign over this whole process, and God is sovereign over your home study. So pray about it and trust God with your home study and just representing your family and who y'all are.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is when they're coming in to do your home study with you, you don't want to project this idea that you are this perfect family. And so perfect families don't do great in foster care and adoption because there's lots of mess that goes on in caring for children and in navigating the system and all the different people that are involved. And so what they really want to see is that you're flexible and that you're able to navigate some of those things, that you can understand where different people are coming from and work within the system, as well as recognizing that you've got conflict in your life. You've got even some past things that you've dealt through and worked through and now are on the other side of, that you've resolved any trauma that you may have in your past. So those are the types of things they're looking for. If they walk in and they see like, hey, everything's just immaculate, probably what they're going to interpret is, yeah, something's wrong here. Like no house is actually like this. They want to see the real you, and they're going to walk through and they're going to check kind of your closets and your rooms, and they're going to ask you questions about your marriage and how you discipline your kids if you have kids in the home already. And so you just want to be able to navigate all those things and answer those questions really transparently and honestly. If you fail a home study, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not ready to foster or adopt, but it does mean that you're going to have to go through that process again. Okay, so if somebody fails you in a home study, you're just going to kind of have to turn around, go back to your community group, reassess some things, and talk through what that means. For some of the agencies that we partner with as a church, we go and kind of have those conversations of, hey, can you help us understand so that we can steward this family towards what kind of decisions they should be considering now?
Yeah, that's great. And so when it comes to preparing your home, you definitely want to think through the physical attributes of your home and your family. So preparing your family, talking about it together with your kids and with anybody that lives in your home. And so when you look at the physical side of your house, you want to walk through your home thinking about the type of child that you're going to be bringing into your home, thinking about their sensory, thinking about their safety, thinking about the space that child's going to need. And so, and again, the type of child or the age of the child, if you're bringing an infant in, you need to think about, plug covers and drawer safeties and all those little things. But if it's going to be an older child, then those are things you don't necessarily need to think about. So keep in mind the child that's going to be in your home to try to make your home fit and make that child comfortable. When you're getting their room together, you want to make sure that they have some of the basics that they need. Bed, place to put clothes, simple things like that. You don't need to fill a room with so many toys and so many posters and all these painted walls of colors and things like that, because often that can be overwhelming to a child that may be coming from very little or coming from nothing. They're showing up at your door with a bag, and that's all their possessions. And so if they walk into a room full of so much stuff, then it can be very overwhelming. And so we want to make sure we just kind of keep in mind where they're coming from, the type of child that they are, how old they are, and how your home can make them feel comfortable. So if you're bringing a child that's from a different background from you, maybe adopting internationally, you want to keep in mind where they're from. Those food differences and things that they're used to are going to help that child feel comfortable. And so if you've got a child that even foster care that's coming in with a different background, try to learn what kind of foods they like. You can't really prepare ahead of time, but you can make quick changes. Amazon Fresh delivers the same day. You can go to the grocery store the same day, but try to make that child feel comfortable at home from the room that they're staying in, from the foods that you're serving, because they had a life before they came to your house, and you can't expect them to just snap and all of a sudden fit exactly perfectly into your home. And so make sure we're working with all those things on how to help that child feel comfortable. You're going to have a community group and a care circle. They can help make some of those things happen. If it's, physical needs or food or whatever it is, make sure you're leaning on those other people because you don't want to be doing this alone.
And keep in mind that a child may have never had the opportunity to pick some of these things out. So maybe they've never been grocery shopping, or not in the way that you go grocery shopping, or maybe they've never gotten to decorate their room or pick out bedding. So while you may be super excited about getting this room all set up and ready for this child, they want to be excited too. They want to engage with you in that, and that can be a great way to build attachment.
Now, when you're preparing your family, as we talked about, you're going to be talking about this a lot. You're going to be talking about between you and your spouse a lot. And you and your family, but you want to make sure that you're also bringing in your children. You want to be praying together as a family. Your children have a voice, and it's a great thing to talk to them and include them in these conversations. Mom and dad are still the leaders of the household, but you want to include your children because they're going to be a part of this as well. And so you want to know where your child's coming from, and you want to talk with your kids about that, if it's international adoption, and just keep them in the loop. So if your child's coming from a different background culturally, make sure that you're, again, just bringing those things into your family, whether it's music or television shows or food or whatever it is, decorations. Help make that child's room or just your house fit that child. So it shouldn't be just in their room. It should be just without the house. You want them to feel comfortable, like when they're in your home, that they're in a home that can be theirs. And so just make them feel really cared for in that way. Your children that are already in the home, you want to remind them that the foster care and adoption is a beautiful thing, that it's a beautiful representation of the gospel, okay? Because it is, and it's a wonderful thing. But you don't want to burden your kids with what we call sibling ministry. And so sibling ministry is where I tell my 4-year-old, hey, you are now needing to love little J like Jesus. And so putting this great burden that she needs to be Jesus to this child, and she has to do it perfectly because she's 4. And so it's not her responsibility to act perfectly in that way. So I want to use that as an opportunity to disciple her as well. But we also just want to encourage them to be loving and kind and not necessarily put the burden of a sibling ministry on them.
It is a cool thing to watch your biological kids grow and learn and express the gospel in their own family as they recognize how you've given of your home to this child. And so you'll watch them mature and grow in ways that you really hadn't imagined. But as you think about the child's culture that you're bringing into the family, you need to recognize that international adoption is not the only time when we bring cultures that aren't like ours into our homes. And so when we fostered, we had a little boy who I'll just call Joey. And he came in and was like 9 months old. But for the first 2 weeks he was with us, he didn't do anything but cry, right? So anytime he was awake, he was crying, and we were just frustrated. We even had one of our friends come over and just kind of spell us for a Saturday, and we went, look, we know he's going to cry the entire time. There's nothing necessarily wrong with him. We've checked him out. We've taken him to the doctor. We fed him. We make sure, he sleeps, all these kinds of things. He's just going to cry the whole time. And she was like, oh, I'll get it. It'll be fine. And we went, okay. And we left. And when we came back, her hair was frazzled and she was frustrated and worn out. And she went, he cried the whole time you were gone. And we took him back and he kept crying and we cared for him. But what we realized about 2 weeks in is he was bouncing on my lap one night. My wife and I were watching TV and all the other kids were down. My wife leaned over and said, "¿Qué pasó, papi?" And we realized that he had been raised since he was born in a Spanish-speaking only home and exclusively breastfed. Okay? And so when she said, "¿Qué pasó?" he turned his head and was like, "Did you just speak my language?" Only he said it, in his head in Spanish and whatever, "Did you just speak my languages?" And so we realized that we had to adjust, that we had to start using what little Spanish we had. And I wasn't able to breastfeed because that's just physically not possible. But we were able to build a relationship with his biological mom whenever visitation started and help kind of meet some of those needs and recognize that, hey, we've got to meet this kid where he's at and not necessarily just assume he's going to assimilate into everything that we do and are here in our own home.
So the chart on your screen is just a simple representation of kind of family structure and function. And so a lot of the families in our families in the church that are viewing this are probably operating somewhere in the high function, high structure, high function, maybe lower structure areas of the chart. But where a lot of the kids that are going to be entering our home are most likely going to be coming from are going to be a low function and low structure, or a low functioner, maybe some higher structure side. And so this is just kind of a reminder that whatever child you bring in your home, you need to kind of move towards wherever they're coming from, is they're going to be moving towards wherever your house operates. And so, because coming into a high functioning, high structured home can be very challenging for a kid who's never had a bedtime, for a kid who's just meal times is when we have food available and when it's here. And so those things, having set times of when we're allowed to do things, or saying, hey, we're going to be on time to swim practice or whatever, those things can just create a lot of stress in somebody that's not used to that. And so as you think about your family and the way y'all operate, it's just something to recognize where you'd fall in this chart. Talk about it with your spouse. Where do you think you fall? Where would a kid that's coming into your home probably fall? And how can we meet them where they're at? And how can we slowly help them kind of move up into a higher functioning, higher structure placement in a type of home?
Yeah, it's not necessarily to say that high function, high structure is the ideal way for a family to live, but the reality is that many of us come from a very affluent background where college education is a must. And yet many of these kids, it's like, hey, a GED may be great for you. And we may still be able to help you learn a trade and those types of things. And so making sure that your expectations are realistic, at the same time looking at yourself and going, hey, are we expecting this kid to translate into our kind of family's way of doing things and our routine and all the stringent or strict things that we have, and meet a child where they're at, create some predictability in your home so that they know what the expectations are, and help your family come together as you begin caring for this child. And even as some of the biological children in your home are like, well, how come the rules are different for him than they are for me? And you'll have to kind of navigate some of those things and explain those differences of why you're meeting that child where they are, and not immediately saying, hey, this kid's going to go to bed exactly when you go to bed and eat what you eat and do all the things that you do. But we're going to recognize that this has not been their life experience, and we want to make sure that they're healthy, that they're healing, and we're able to care for them well.
If you remember in session 4, we talked about care circles and the importance of care circles. We're just going to double down here and touch on just staying connected throughout the process. And so it's important that you have people that care for you when you're in the middle of foster care and adoption, and you also want to be connected to other people that have gone through or are going through the same things that you are right now. And so if you're getting licensed for foster care or adoption, if you're in the waiting process, and so connect with other people that are also going through licensing or have done the waiting process before. It's important to not do it alone. And so on a local level, there's groups at I know the church around here where there's dad's meet and greets and mom meet and greets, but also on a national level, there are lots of groups around the country that meet as people that are waiting or have gone through the foster care or adoption process. And so a lot of agencies have their own support groups that you can connect with. And if you don't know any and you are alone, then you might be the solution to your own problem. Start a support group, because I guarantee you are not alone. You are not the only person going through this. And the last thing you need to do is to feel like you're alone or do this alone. And so those support groups are great encouragement just to remind each other about why we're going through this, and just how important it is to care for kids in that way. So along with just connecting with other people and support groups, there's certain things that your child's going to need. If you have no children in your home, well, newsflash, they're going to need a pediatrician and they're going to need a dentist. And so go ahead, you can search out in your community, ask people, neighbors that have kids or friends that have kids, hey, where do they go? Because many pediatricians or dentists are actually very open to talking with you and meeting with you before you have a child in your home. I know when my wife and I went through the process, she had met in person with a pediatrician, and they were all, actually a couple of them, they were all very kind and very encouraging, and said, hey, if you have questions when you're going through the waiting process, if you have questions when they come home the first day, feel free to call me. And so they're very supportive and encouraging. Same thing with the dentist. If you're going through the foster care system, make sure you find a pediatrician that works within the medical system that's going to be provided. And so they'll have selected doctors or a dentist that you can go to. Find one and introduce yourself, at least through email, talking to them, because in foster care, you're going to have only a couple days to get in. And even if you're doing domestic infant adoption or international adoption, you're going to want to get in quickly. And so make sure you just start building those relationships before you need them, before the child gets to your home. So last thing is you want to make sure you're seeking out families at your church to develop your network of the same ethnicity or cultural background as your child. And so if they're coming from international adoption, you know where they're coming from, and you can seek that out early. And so make sure that you're building those relationships. There's lots of support groups I know on Facebook and other forms of social media for different countries. And so make sure that you're developing those relationships. If it's with foster care, you might not know what cultural background they're going to come from. But if you have a child come to your home and you have no friends that look like them or sound like them, well, start trying to make some new friends. And so you want that child to have some role models that look like them, that sound like them. And so it's important that they stay connected to their cultural background. So that could really mean you go out and start making some new friends. And so that's just something to keep in mind and consider as you're processing which way to go, what steps to choose, because you want to help encourage your child in that way. You're still their parent and you're going to raise them, but they need that connection to their culture and their background. That's going to be really important to help them just kind of grow up and develop.
Yeah, what a great opportunity to allow the church to be the church and to wrap around your family, but also wrap around that child and be a role model for them. So we want to transition from you talking about your home and how to get that prepared to you actually identifying the kinds of kids that you feel prepared to adopt, to foster, and moving forward from there. And so we're going to put up a few pictures of the types of kids that are currently waiting for adoption. This is one of my friends who I've followed for years. You can see a picture of him when he's young, and then sort of this progression of him to where you realize, like, gosh, he's smiling when he's younger, and now in this picture on the far right, he's older and he's not really smiling anymore. And the reason being is because he's kind of grown up in foster care, and he's probably been through multiple foster care placements. He might even been through an adoptive placement where he's just realized, look, no one wants to adopt me. And so there's sort of that hopefulness that has been drained from him. And as we consider the kinds of kids that we're willing to adopt, we have to be thoughtful, recognizing that many of these kids have spent time in foster care for years, or in an orphanage for years, and they've had people come visit their orphanage and have adopted some of their peers that were there and not adopted them. And so they realize that they've kind of become this unadoptable population, if you will, that can be incredibly disheartening and saddening for that child. So the next picture is a picture of 3 siblings. We know that there are special populations within foster care that are getting more recruitment efforts, and that is minority kids and sibling groups. And so this is a sibling group of older kids. We know statistically that after a child is 8, the chances that they'll be adopted drastically goes down. After they pass the age of 12, chances get even more scarce that they're going to be adopted. And we consider a child over the age of 6 an older child, which, if you can just imagine that for a second, an older child who barely just started first grade at 6 years old or kindergarten at 6 years old, right? And so you're likely thinking about what kind of child would be able to fit into your home. And there's lots of talk around a fit for your home and that child that's going to fit into your family. And while I want to encourage you to be thoughtful about those things, at the same time, I want you to kind of maybe loosen your grip on this idea of fit, right? Because it's not like this child is just going to come in and immediately assimilate. And yet at the same time, a child does want to fit into a family. They do want to be loved and cared for. There are routines that you're going to have to reset. It's not just like adding one more person in and just everything can continue as normal. When you're adding a child to your family, the dynamics of the entire family often change. Okay, because those relationships change and everybody's going to have a little bit of a different relationship. Not necessarily in a bad way. Sometimes that's amazing and great. And so the last special population that we're recruiting for oftentimes are children with special needs. And so sometimes those special needs are really minimal and sometimes they're profound. But as you can see, when kids have special needs, the likelihood of them being adopted are decreased, and so they spend more time in foster care, which often means their attachments with safe caregivers who are invested in them, not just for a few years, but for the rest of their life, go down as they bounce from one home to another to another. Sometimes that's because of behavioral issues that come up. Sometimes that's just different dynamics that happen in their life or in the life of the families that are caring for them, or in the residential treatment centers where they're being cared for, because that was the only bed that could be found to care for that child. And so yes, there are some tragic stories for those kids, but oftentimes they don't look great on paper. They don't have these stacks of of information on each of these children that just look like, oh gosh, this kid's never made a mistake in their life. They're going to fit right in. And yet, if any one of us was followed around from the time we were 0 to 9, 10, 11, 12, we probably wouldn't look great on paper either. And so keep those things in mind as you're considering which kids to open your family and your home to. And so it's helpful to acknowledge and keep in mind what you want for your life and what God wants for your life. Maybe two very different things. You may have plans and you may have ideas of what foster care or adoption is going to look like for you, and God may have different plans. God may be going, look, if you will trust me and place your faith in me, I will show you that my plans are better. But you're going to have to take that step of faith. You're going to have to walk with me and trust that you're able to do more than what you think you're able to do. I know that for my wife and I, when we first started, we just kind of thought, gosh, we're only equipped to care for kids like 0 to 2 because that's all we had experienced. And over time, we were able to kind of broaden that range to be able to say, hey, we can take kids all the way up to the age of 18. And so we started to open up and realize, gosh, like we could take a child with special needs as we learned more and as we felt more confident. And so I'm not asking you to consider children that you just could not care for at all, you have no experience with, but I am asking you to be thoughtful about that as you grow, because we know that many foster families will close their homes after about a year of foster parenting and just kind of go, gosh, we didn't feel equipped that we could do any more. And so there is training out there. There are opportunities for you to open your home to older children and be thoughtful about the realities of what those kids are going through and the fact that they want a family. They often are just looking for one that's going to meet them where they are and then disciple them into where God really wants them to be. So Justin mentioned earlier that there's a form for everything. And this particular form is one of those like, gosh, we're going to go down and we're going to check off the characteristics of children that we would consider fostering or adopting. And yes, we want you to be prayerful about the criteria that you're going to use to decide which children you foster or adopt and seek godly counsel in that. But you also need to recognize that every time that you say, hey, we're not equipped or we don't feel good about this, that in some ways you're reducing the number of kids that you're going to be open to. I get a lot of phone calls from families that say, gosh, we just have been waiting around for 6 months, waiting for a placement, and we thought we would have a child in our home by now. And then I turn around and ask, like, okay, well, what kind of range or criteria did you say that you would be open to? And they're like, well, we picked a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby girl. And I just went, well, everybody's looking to foster or adopt that child. Everybody wants to adopt that child. That may be why you've been waiting so long, because those children are fewer and further between. And so if you will kind of loosen your grip on what you have in mind specifically and allow God to guide you, again, with that godly counsel from those in your circle of care or those in your community group or Sunday school class or Bible study that just love you and know you well and go, hey, you could care for a child of a different race, or you could care for a child who maybe has special needs. You could care for an older child. I know that for us, when we started considering adopting older children, we kind of realized, gosh, it's great because they're at school and they wipe themselves, right? Like all those kinds of things that, like, I didn't want to change diapers forever. And yet we did have to go through that season to gain some confidence in parenting younger kids so that then we could parent older kids. So the form that you get will look a lot like this. And it'll have all these different criteria, all these specific things, whether a child's missing a limb or has albinism or dwarfism or has epilepsy or maybe has been exposed to hepatitis. And you need to think through the types of things that would actually impair your ability to parent that child or would change your lifestyle, and think about, hey, is that a way that could be a good change for our lifestyle and a good change for our family, that we would spend more time caring for the needs of these kids? Especially when you think internationally, a lot of kids will be listed as special needs just because they have a cleft palate or they have a heart murmur. And when they're brought over to the United States, we have the medical technology to be able to help take care of those things and help heal a child, whereas internationally, when they're in an orphanage, they tend to just be left to kind of care for themselves and just kind of left there. So be thoughtful about which things you actually feel like you could care for, and know that you likely could care for way more than what you feel you can.
Yeah, and I would also just add that when you think through that form, it's important to not make decisions out of fear. And so Bruce talked about looking things up. really research what some of those things are. If you don't know what they are, don't just go, I don't know what that is.
I can't pronounce it.
Yeah, like, because it can be scary. There's a whole lot more things on that form that I knew existed. And so, but don't just look at what that is. As Bruce talked about, what can be a fit for your family and your home. Look at what does it look like to care for and love a child that has epilepsy or whatever it is. How would that impact your home? Not just, oh, what is this word? I don't know what it is. And so really take your time with the form, pray through those things. And if it takes you a couple days or a week to work through the whole thing, like, that's okay. You should be wrestling with those things because it's important to think about what's open to your family, but certainly don't make decisions out of fear and unknown.
Yeah. So the other thing that we experienced in foster care specifically was we kind of went through that form. We marked down the things we felt equipped to care for and address in our home. And then sometimes we'd still get a phone call for a child that was older than the range that we may have set because they needed a family, they needed a home for that child, and we were open. And so you may experience that where they go, hey, well, we don't have a kid in the age range, but we do have this kid and maybe their sibling, or we do have a kid in the age range, but they come with a sibling. And so be thoughtful about what you'd be able to do in response to that, how you'd respond to that, and certainly ask yourself how God may have already equipped you to care for a child with special needs. Do you know ASL? Do you have a sibling or a friend who has a child with Down syndrome that you could learn from, or a neighbor who's like a special ed teacher or something like that, or somebody in your church or your community group that could support you through that and help equip you, that you could care for them and that they could even join in on. But remember that God may be planning to equip you for something He's about to do through you but hasn't revealed yet. And it's always awesome when God shows up and gets to flex and we get to go, God, I knew that I should trust you. I knew that I could be faithful and that you would show up in an awesome way and that you would stretch me to grow. We certainly didn't start out being able to care for a lot of kids at one time, and God just went, look, if you'll trust me, I'll stretch you and make you capable and confident to care for more kids than what you previously had in your mind. So the matching process looks a little different depending upon which avenue you take. In international adoption, the selection process is generally referral based, meaning you identify an agency you're going to work with, they work in the country that you're going to adopt from, and then you start to look at children that you feel like you want to adopt, and your agency and the agency there within that country talk. You may accept or decline placements or matches, and then remember that a child rarely has a voice in that matching process. So it's usually like, hey, you're my mom, you're my dad, and we just met. Like, that's a crazy concept to think that that's how that all works, and yet in many ways, that's how it works. Even for younger kids, it's like, hey, so you're in China or you're in South Korea and you're being adopted by this white family that's come over, and hey, here's mom and here's dad. Same thing kind of happens in foster care where we're making those matches, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second.
Something else to remember when it's international adoption is that whatever country you're going to, they may not have as developed bureaucracy as America has, because we have a lot, but they also may not have really detailed documentation. And so you're going to be trusting God a lot through this process, and you're going to have to trust God some with some of the documentation. You might desire to get a full medical report, blood test results, exact birth certificate, date of birth, and all those things on whatever child you're adopting. But in reality, some of those things just aren't going to be there, and you're just not going to know. You're not going to have definitive answers, or it might not be the most reliable thing. So they're going to do the best they can, but you just got to remember to hold some of those things loosely. You're trusting God through this, and just be willing to flex with a lot of it.
Yeah, the other thing that I'd tack on is that sometimes in international adoption, orphanages will make a child out to be on paper younger than they actually are, because they know that people that are coming over to adopt those kids want younger kids. And so in order to get them adopted, they may make them look or sound 2 years younger than they actually are. And then when you get that child home and you realize, like, oh, wait, your birthday is not the birthday that we thought it was. And so they may actually be more mature developmentally or chronologically than they actually are on the paperwork, because you said you wanted a 6-year-old and they went, well, we've only got 8-year-olds and up. And they went, okay, well, in order to get one of these children adopted, we're going to have to make them out to be 6. So yes, that's wrong. And yet at the same time, also consider some of your own expectations and preconceived notions around that whole process of wanting a younger child. So in the U.S. foster care system, the selection is generally based on foster or adoptive parent preferences, proximity to the child's home of origin or wherever they were removed from, and then the availability of a bed for their age, gender, and level of care. So recognize that caseworkers, whenever they have to remove a child from a family, are often left with just sort of a, hey, what's just out there? They're not necessarily able to go, which is the best quality home that is available. And that's why even when you have enough foster homes in your county for the children that are removed from that county, we are always like, hey, we want more foster families that are available from the church who have this biblical worldview, that are willing to give and sacrifice of themselves and not necessarily just look at their own preferences. And so that's important, because many times I've talked with caseworkers and they've just gone, look, I only have bad choices in front of me. I only have a residential treatment place and a shelter. I don't actually have a bed for this child who's over the age of 10. And in many of our affluent communities, we have lots of families that are available for kids ages like 0 to 4, and no families available for kids that are over the age of 6 or certainly over the age of 10 or 12. So again, if you feel like we're hammering down on this whole like consider older children and some of the kids that we mentioned at the beginning of this section, then that's why, because those kids are just kind of being left and thrown to the wayside. When we reached out to our agency before we adopted our oldest son, we called and said, hey, we think we want to adopt a boy between the ages of 10 and 15. Do you know of any? And their response was, gosh, anytime we get an email for a child over the age of 8, we press delete, because there aren't families looking to adopt those children. And that both crushed us personally for our agency and their lack of compassion and pursuing the adoption of those kids, but it also crushed us just for the reality that the church was going, hey, we'll only take the kids that we really prefer. We don't really want these harder to place kids or these kids with more trauma, maybe because we don't feel equipped, or maybe because we're just not trusting the Lord like we should. So be thoughtful in those things. We certainly don't want to guilt you into adopting older children, but we do want you to be mindful of it. Lastly, you can accept or decline a placement. Okay, so be thoughtful about that. Your state likely has an adoption resource exchange that you can look at pictures of kids that are waiting to be adopted. There's usually just like a blurb there. That's where some of those pictures we posted before are from. But you can also go to adoptuskids.org and find pictures of kids from all across the country. So you don't just have to adopt children from your county or your state. You can adopt across state lines through a process that they call ICPC. There are lots of acronyms. I'm not going to go into what that one means. But you can adopt outside of your state if there's a child, and so we would encourage you to look far and wide. There's certainly not a, hey, you've got to adopt from foster care or foster first. That God hasn't drawn the boundary lines on the globe and said, well, you Americans should only deal here and those from Africa should only deal here. We certainly think that children belong in families. And you've got to be thoughtful about what that means for you and where you would go and what God would have you do. So if you feel moved to go adopt from China, you shouldn't feel any regret or any hesitation that you're not opening your home through foster care. And yet there are plenty of people out there who will say, gosh, don't you know we have children who are right here in America that need your home, that need your family? And we can say yes. And there are children over in China that don't even have a foster care system to support them, or children in Africa who are in orphanages, or Romania and Russia and so on and so forth. So be thoughtful about the matching process, again, as you're identifying your child. Domestic adoption or private infant adoption, the selection process is generally based on the expecting mother's preferences. So you create kind of a life book for you and your family. You make yourself look as awesome as you possibly can, and maybe you're super into crafting, or however you make that thing look really polished. You get to put that in front of your agency, and your agency puts that in front of an expecting mother, and then she's going to determine, hey, do I feel like this family can care for my child? Plan on at least one failed match due to a change in the mother's decision to parent. So that happens pretty frequently. And yes, it's heartbreaking and crushing, but you've got to be mindful that that is a reality that you might face. Another aspect of identifying the child that you're going to care for in your home is transracial adoption. I'm going to use this term. It's called disproportionality. And what it means is that children of color, typically black children, are going to be more represented in the foster care system than they are in the general population. And this is true all across the United States. So typically it's about 30% of children in foster care that are black. and yet only about 10% in the general population. And so they're overrepresented. There aren't enough black families to care for those children. And mindfully, I think it's important that children be in families that look like their own, but even more important that they're actually in families. And so consider how you would provide for a child that has a different race than yours. We certainly don't want to reject a child because of their race, nor do we want to adopt a child because of their race. It's a little foolish for us to be like, hey, we want to adopt a black child. So we want to adopt children that need families, not necessarily be so discriminate about which children we adopt and what color they are, but keeping in mind that there are children of color that need families and are often being overlooked, even to the point that our state and federal governments have gone, okay, we're going to subsidize adoptions of children that are minorities. So you may get a subsidy, which is sort of like an ongoing foster care payment all the way until a child's 18, if it's a minority over the age of 2. But if it's a white child that is under the age of 6, they may not get a subsidy. And so just be mindful of some of those nuances. Certainly respect a child's cultural influences and affirm and celebrate what is good about those. We do lots of different things with our Hispanic children. We've learned to really love Ethiopian food for our daughter who's from Ethiopia, and yet I can't speak a lick of Amharic. But we've surrounded her with other people who can. We've helped build up those relationships and encouraged her towards that, and not been afraid that when she's speaking Amharic, she's talking about us, because the reality is she probably is talking about us. But we're not so insecure that we're really worried about it. We get that she's a kid and that she's learning and she's growing, but we want to honor her culture and honor the fact that she grew up in a country where she spoke Amharic, and we don't want her to lose that aspect. So be prepared to work through racial issues. You may have family members that have concerns around that. Be sensitive to those, and yet at the same time, we don't want to place that burden on a child, and we want to address that head on so that we can care for children well and that they can feel welcome wherever they are. Another consideration is children with special needs. So adopting a child with special needs or caring for a child through foster care with special needs really does offer special blessings. And I realize that can sound cliche, but there is something about caring for a child that recognizes their own dependence and their own needs along the way that just really opens your eyes to the goodness of God. As we look at Scripture, we have to keep in mind that Jesus literally tells a parable where he says, look, I want my house to be full. Go out into the streets and bring in the lame and the deaf and the mute and the blind, that my house would be full. And so there is literally a command. God is literally saying, hey, we want to go out and reach those who are in the margins, who are not being cared for, and care for them, because that's who we are as God's people. And so it addresses a great need. It requires long-term commitment, certainly, but there are often reduced fees and things, varying requirements when adopting a child with special needs. There are certainly free resources available to parents and families with children requiring special needs as you work with your school system. There are all kinds of considerations to be thoughtful about as you need speech therapy and occupational therapy, or you need somebody to come to your house. There's a lot of that anyway, just all the different people that are invested in making sure that this child is cared for well. I've met some folks that have done hospice care for children in foster care, and man, how encouraging it is to hear their stories as they just went, look, we were told that this child wouldn't even make it past the age of 1, and now they're 15. Like, they were told by the state that this child would not survive past 12 months. And yet with the love and care that they had in their home and their family, regardless of how profound the special needs of that child were, they're watching this child thrive and learn and grow. And so we've had good friends who have opened their home to children with special needs. We've gotten to be a part of supporting and encouraging them. And I want to encourage you towards that as you consider the type of kids that you open your home to. Lastly, birth order seems to be something that comes up a lot. And certainly the general wisdom is, yes, let's consider birth order, let's follow birth order, but also keep in mind that somebody's kind of place in the family is always going to get upset. Whoever was youngest when you add another biological child to the family is no longer the youngest. So recognize that birth order can matter to children already in your home. Be thoughtful about how it will impact them, but God can overcome some of those challenges, and a key way in addressing those is how you approach your children and talk to them about what to expect and some of the different dynamics that may come up. One of the things we want to make sure that you're aware of is the idea of artificial twinning. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend identifying a foster or adopted child to come into your home who's the exact same age as another child already in your home. That can be sort of an awkward, as it's like, wait, we're the same age, but we weren't born at the same time. Am I older? Am I more mature socially? You know, do we run in the same circles and those kinds of things? So it can be helpful if you've got older kids to care for younger kids and open your home there, or it can be helpful if you've got younger kids to open your home to a little bit older kids and move forward in that direction. But do be thoughtful about artificial twinning. Again, God can overcome all those things. We've experienced some awesome things as we've adopted older kids, and then we've adopted younger kids, and we've fostered older kids and fostered younger kids, and just trusted God with all of it.
All right, y'all, thanks for hanging with us for session 5. We got to talk about your home and just getting prepared for a child, and then identifying that child as well. There are a lot of discussion questions in your book, and so really dive into those, talk and engage with the people that you're going through this course with, and we are looking forward to seeing you in session 6.